Good afternoon, Sue.
Hi, John.
You look like you're dressed for winter today.
Say again?
I say you look like you're dressed for winter today.
Yeah, well, except it's about 86 here
Oh,
today.
is it really?
Oh,
Wow.
yeah. The temperature will drop again over the weekend, but for the rest of the week, it's going to be very warm. But we're in air conditioning and I get
Oh,
cold, so
yeah. Well, I'm like you. I'm cold all the time. That's why I like South Texas.
yeah. How's the weather there?
Well, I'm actually in Oklahoma.
Oh, okay. Are you there
And
now for the summer?
what's that? Yeah, I
Are
stay
you
there.
there now for the summer?
Yes, we're there for the summer. We, you may recall, we have a place along a river that's just very delightful, and we enjoy it. It's a great place to have family and friends, and everybody seems to like coming to here for a little change of pace.
Oh, good. Good for you.
Yeah. So anyway, we're here and we're settled. Looks like Fred. Is that Fred? No, that's not
That's
Fred.
that's not Fred.
That's Harold. I'm a friend of Fred's.
No, I don't know who Barry is. Do you?
No, looks like he's getting on. Well, Sue, now you've been back in Boston. It was with your daughter, as I recall.
Well, yeah, my daughter lives in Cambridge, but they primarily spend their time. My son-in-law has a farm that's been in their family for 7 generations.
Whoa.
So they spend a lot of, especially this time of the year, farms are a lot of work.
Yes. Busy time of year. So he's a
Hi, John.
farmer, huh?
Hi, Fred.
Hi, Sue.
Good afternoon, Fred.
Hi.
Hello, Fred.
Hi, Harold.
Did you get my message?
Oh, no, what?
You need to get it and then call me after you get it.
Okay.
Sue, where is their farm?
In southwestern Vermont, due east of Albany,
Oh, okay.
they have about 300 acres and it's a tremendous amount of work.
Oh, boy. You bet. What do they raise?
Not so much, well, they were dairy farmers previous generations, but not now. They have a big vegetable garden and they in the summer raise chickens that go to the slaughterhouse so they can eat them all winter. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Mostly, it's stuff like they have to keep everything mowed and they've got about 100 acres of woods and they're under contract to the state to maintain them. So they had all those big windstorms this past
Oh,
winter
yeah.
and there's like 100 trees that have to be cut down. So there's always something.
Mindy, I'm
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Lou. Hey, Lou.
Hey, Harold, how are you?
Okay, buddy.
Your wife's or my wife's coming here.
Hey, Daddy.
Hey, honey.
Hey, Fred.
Hey, Freddie.
Hey, guys. We'll give it a couple more minutes, see if anybody else
Okay.
logs in.
Fred, you have us hooked.
What you have to do to get it?
Hey, Sue,
Yeah,
did you have any problems this time?
no, I just wrote the code down and put it in, the boxes. It,
One. Okay. Sorry, I'm
I
trying to
mean,
figure
it
out.
works, so
Okay.
as long
Thank
as I
you.
don't make mistakes with the numbers, it's fine.
I understand.
Okay, well, let's begin. This week we're going to talk about the Jews of Spain. If you're following in the outline, it's on page 9 of the outline. And the Jews of Spain are called Sephardim or Sephardic Jews, and it's derived from the Hebrew word Sepharad, which is the Hebrew name for Spain. They believe that their history actually goes back to the biblical period. There's a verse from the prophet Obadiah that talks about the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad. And also, the Bible talks a lot about a place called Tarshish, and nobody's exactly sure where it is. You remember the story of Jonah when God tells him to go to Nineveh, and he wants to get as far away from Nineveh as he can, and so he jumps on a ship for Tarshish. The book of Samuel is full of stories about treasure ships from Tarshish who come into Israeli ports during King Solomon's reign. So that all we know about it is it was a very wealthy trading center, and it was somewhere on the west side of the Mediterranean, and nobody's really sure where. But the Sephardic Jews believe that it's a Spanish city of Tortosa, which is on the Mediterranean coast of Spain, right near the mouth of the Guadalquivir, and that this was the city that the Bible talked about, so that there was already a Jewish center in Spain, even during biblical times. We know that during the time of the Roman Empire, a lot of Jews moved into Spain. Some of them voluntarily, merchants who took advantage of the Pax Romana, the good roads the Romans built to trade as far as Spain. But when also many of them came there as slaves. After the first 2 centuries, when the revolts against Rome failed, there were tens of thousands of Jews who were sold into slavery all over the Roman Empire, and some of them ended up in Spain. So there was a Sephardic origin there also. We don't have any record of any rebellions against Rome from the Spanish Jews. So apparently they lived fairly peacefully within the Western Roman Empire. But in the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire fell apart, and Spain was overrun by a number of northern European Germanic tribes. The first ones were the Vandals. The Vandals briefly settled there but didn't stay. They moved on to found a kingdom in North Africa. But they did leave their name. They were called Southern Spain Vandalusia, which eventually became Andalusia. The second wave that followed the Vandals were the Visigoths. And the Visigoths did settle in Spain. They ruled it for almost 2 centuries. And the Jews actually originally did fairly well under Visigothic rule. The Visigoths were a lot of the other barbarian tribes that overran the Roman Empire. They converted to Christianity, but many of them converted to a form of Christianity called Arian Christianity. And Arian Christianity was one of the big heresies that really shook up the church in its first few centuries. Arius was a bishop who essentially believed that while Jesus was the Messiah, he did not have any divine nature. He was just an ordinary man who God had chosen to be the Messiah and gave him the powers he needed, to do that. And in other words, the Arians denied the Trinity. They denied that Jesus was literally the Son of God or that he had a divine nature. And so most of them were excommunicated by the Vatican. They weren't considered Orthodox Christians, which was good for the Jews because it meant they didn't have to carry out the Vatican's anti-Jewish policies. And so the Jews actually thrived initially under Visigothic rule. A problem came later, though, late in the 7th century. One of the Visigothic kings was having trouble with a rebellion from his nobles, and he decided it would be better if he were part of the church. And so he decided to give up his Arian heresy, embrace Orthodox Christianity, and establish ties with the Vatican. The problem was that the Vatican, as a price of that, insisted that he had to get rid of the Jews. The Jews of Spain would either have to convert or they would have to leave. And in the last years of the 7th century, many Jews began leaving Spain. It looked like this might be the end of the Jewish settlement in Spain. But fortunately, they were rescued by the Muslims. In 711, a Muslim army crossed over from Morocco to Spain and drove out the Visigoths. They didn't drive them completely out of Spain. The Muslims basically took over central and southern Spain, what we call Andalusia. They still left a few small Visigothic kingdoms in the north, in the mountainous part of Spain. Castile, uh, Asturias, Leon. There were 4 or 5 small kingdoms. And actually, the Muslims didn't stop there. Muslim armies actually crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, into France rather. And this was really the first serious Muslim effort to try to conquer Europe. And they actually progressed pretty far into to France. They were finally stopped in 732. There was a major battle at Tours where they were finally defeated and driven back by Charles Martel, who was Charlemagne's grandfather. The French actually have named a really good cognac after him. The French know how to honor their great men. So, but things finally settled down by the mid-8th century, with the Muslims controlling central and southern Spain and the small Christian kingdoms still in the north of the country. And this really was the beginning of what's called the Jewish Golden Age in Spain. Um, the basic rule that the Muslims followed when treating non-Muslims was something called the Pact of Umar. And if you have the outline, it may read the Past of Umar. That's a typo. If you have that, it's the Pact of Umar. And Umar was the second of the caliphs who succeeded Muhammad after the death of Muhammad. And basically, the Pact of Umar really was a letter. One of his generals had just conquered a major city, and he sent Umar a letter saying, "What do you want me to do with these people?" And Umar's reply became a guide for future caliphs in the way that Muslims should treat non-Muslims in Muslim countries. And essentially, what it consisted of is that paganism was not to be tolerated. Pagans were going to be given a choice between conversion to Islam or death. On the other hand, the Quran lists Moses and Jesus as prophets of God, and they both received a revelation from God, even though God's greatest revelation, the final one, was to Muhammad. Still, Christianity and Judaism were considered legitimate religions, and Jews and Christians would not be forced to convert. They were allowed to live in Muslim societies. There was some fine print with that, though. They would have to pay a small sort of poll tax for the privilege of living in a Muslim country. No Jew or Christian could ride a horse or wear a sword. No synagogue or church could be higher than the lowest mosque in the town. And there were a number of other rules that followed that. And obviously Jews and Christians would be second-class citizens in Muslim society, but they would not be persecuted. And so what you had was discrimination, but not persecution, which was a far better deal than the other Jews in Christian Europe were getting. And how tightly it was enforced really depended on the individual caliph. And the Jews of Spain were fortunate to have a succession of caliphs who really were very liberal in their interpretation of it. The status that the Jews and Christians had, called in Arabic, was called dhimmi, which meant protected ones. And it's interesting, the pact actually continued even into the modern era. In 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah's government and began his Muslim government in Iran, one of the first things he did was to call a meeting with the leaders of the Jewish community and tell them that as far as he was concerned, the Pact of Umar was still in force, and Jews who stayed in Iran, would not be harmed. They would not be persecuted. So it was really a living document, even into the modern era. And the Jews were fortunate in a sense that at that time, in the early Middle Ages, The Muslims had probably the most advanced culture in the world. Muslim scholars were translating the Greek and Latin classics into Arabic. And this was at a time when half the nobility of Europe couldn't write their own names. So the Jews of Spain were fortunate to be part of an advanced Muslim country and a very diverse country. You know, as the Muslims swept over North Africa, most of the pagans converted. So the army that finally conquered Spain were partly Arab, partly Berbers from North Africa, partly Libyans, partly Algerians, you know, people from all over North Africa, which had been swept up by the Muslim army, many of whom ended up in Spain. So it was a very diverse kind of a culture. And also major things were going on, you know, back in the Middle East with Islam. You know, when Muhammad died, it was not really clear who was going to rule Islam after that. The Quran doesn't say anything about who ruled Islam. And Muhammad apparently never designated a successor. But in the last few days of his life and his last illness, when he was too weak to lead the daily prayers, he told his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, to lead the prayers. And so it was assumed that when Muhammad died, that Abu Bakr would be his choice, you know, as a leader. And Abu Bakr became the first caliph. The word in Arabic means successor or deputy. And the first four caliphs were all members of Muhammad's family. They were all related to him in one way or another. Abu Bakr was succeeded by Umar, then Othman, and the fourth caliph was Ali. And Ali was doubly related to Muhammad. He was a cousin of Muhammad, but he also married Muhammad's daughter Aisha. So he was also Muhammad's son-in-law. But about this time, there was a segment of Islam who didn't really believe that the caliphate should be hereditary. They believed that the caliph should be elected, and just because you were descended from Muhammad didn't make you automatically a ruler in Islam. There was a rebellion against Ali. He and his two sons were eventually killed, and that actually was the source of the major split in Islam. The followers of Ali refused to recognize anyone else as a leader in Islam. They believed that Ali had been unjustly deprived of it, and they formed the Shia branch of Islam. Shia basically means a follower of Ali. And of course, since there was no rule really for who was going to be caliph after that, various factions just fought over it. Ali was succeeded by a family called the Umayyad family, who ruled for several generations. But the Umayyads were then overthrown by another family, the Abbasids, who ruled for the next 4 or 5 centuries. The Abbasids killed all the Umayyads they could find when they took over. One of them escaped, though. A man named Abd al-Rahman managed to escape and made his way to Spain, where he was recognized by the Spanish Muslims as their caliph. So while the rest of the Muslim empire was being ruled by the Abbasids, Spain was being ruled by the Umayyads. And Abd al-Rahman established his capital at Cordoba. And he was a very liberal caliph. He believed that the Pact of Umar should be administered very liberally. He promoted Jews and Christians to high offices in his administration, and that really marked the golden age for the Jews in Spain. Spanish historians often call that the convivencia, the living together. It was one of the rare times in history when Jews, Christians, and Muslims actually lived together, cooperated in a positive sort of way. And a number of things came out of that. You can actually see some of the traces of that even in the modern world. An example would be when Muslims name their children, you know, for boys, Muhammad is by far the most popular name. But they also named them after Moses and Jesus. In Arabic, Moses is Musa and Jesus is Isa. And these are also fairly popular Muslim names for their sons. You know, now no Christian would ever name their son Jesus, with the obvious exception of Hispanic Christians, where Jesus is a fairly common given name. which probably dates back to the Muslim influence, back in Spain. You even see traces of it in the modern Spanish language. In modern Spanish, if you want to say "I wish" or "if only," the word you usually use is "ojalá," and that again is derived from the Arabic "inshallah," God willing. So there are traces of Arabic even in modern Spanish. Um, the Jews actually developed their own language during this time. It was called Judeo-Arabic. And Judeo-Arabic is basically the Arabic language, but written with the Hebrew alphabet. It's really kind of a counterpart of the Yiddish that the Eastern European Jews developed, where with Yiddish, you're basically writing German words, but with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. In Judeo-Arabic, you're doing basically the same thing, writing Arabic, but using the Hebrew alphabet to do it. And most Jewish scholars actually wrote it in that language. Almost everything Maimonides wrote was written in Judeo-Arabic. And the Golden Age there produced a number of really interesting characters. One was Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who lived mainly in the 10th and early 11th centuries. He was a physician, but also an advisor and a diplomat for Abd al-Rahman III, the third member of the al-Rahman dynasty. He made a number of trips all over the Muslim world as a diplomat for Abd al-Rahman. And actually, what he did when he got to the East, particularly in Babylonia, is what in the modern corporate world we would call headhunting. What he did was to seek out some of the most eminent scholars in the Babylonian Talmudic academies and bring them back to Spain, so that Spain actually formed its own centers of Talmudic study, and we're no longer relying on Babylonia, as the authoritative center, for rabbinic studies. Another one, Samuel ibn Nagrela, again, another 10th figure, early 11th figure Jew, was probably the only Jew who commanded a Muslim army. He was the military chief of staff of the Emir of Granada and actually commanded the Muslim armies of Granada, something that no Jew in history before or since has ever done. The other two people they produced who were really probably the best known products of the Golden Age, one is Yehuda Halevi, who was the greatest of all the Spanish poets, and arguably maybe the greatest of all the Jewish poets. He wrote both in Arabic and in Hebrew. The work that he's remembered most for is a work called Al-Khazari. And Al-Khazari is based on an obscure people called the Khazars. The Khazars lived in the Caucasus, the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, pretty much where Armenia and Georgia and Azerbaijan are now. And in the 11th century, for some reason, we don't know why, they converted to Judaism. Now, there's a lot of argument among scholars about that. Some believe that all the Khazars converted to Judaism. Some believe that only the royal family did. Because the Khazars were eventually absorbed into the Tsarist Empire in Russia. And so some of the Russian Jews may trace their ancestry to these Khazars. And the history kind of fascinated Yehuda Halevi. And so he wrote a long epic poem, which is kind of a dialogue. And here he imagines the king of the Khazars, wanting to give up paganism and join one of these new monotheistic religions, but he has to decide which one, he's going to join. So he summons representatives from the Jewish community, the Christian community, the Islamic community, and also invites a couple of Greek philosophers to prevent their way of life. And the poem is a long dialogue with Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Greek philosophers, all arguing for their way of life before the king of the Khazars. And in the end, the king of the Khazars is most swayed by the Jewish arguments and converts to Judaism. Although there's one theory that what finally made up his mind was he asked the Christian, if I can't be a Christian, if you couldn't be a Christian, would you rather be a Muslim or a Jew? The Christian says, well, if you had to choose, I'd rather be a Jew. He then asked the Muslim, if you couldn't be a Muslim, would you rather be a Christian or a Jew? And the Muslim said, if I had to choose, I would be a Jew. And so that he figured that was at least the second choice of the other two, and went ahead and adopted Judaism. Um, and of course, the greatest product of the Spanish Golden Age, although he really didn't stay in Spain, his career was really elsewhere, was Moses ben Maimonides. And he was born in Cordoba in 1135. But this was about the time when the Golden Age was coming to an end, when Christians and Muslims were fighting, during the Crusades. And so he left Spain when he was a teenager. So even though obviously Spain, the Sephardic Jews claim him as one of their great philosophers, he really didn't spend most of his life in Spain. Although there is a statue of him today in Cordoba, which is his birthplace, but most of his career was spent in Egypt. So. And like all good things, the Golden Age finally came to an end for a number of reasons. One, in the late 10th century, the Umayyad Caliphate, the Al-Rahman dynasty, finally died out. And so even though southern Spain remained Muslim, it broke up into separate city-states, each with its own emir. There was no longer any central government for Muslim Spain, which made it easier for the Christians to eventually take it back. And the other, of course, the great disaster in Jewish life in the Middle Ages was the Crusades, which began in 1096. And though usually, we think of the Crusades as a bunch of people running off to the Middle East, to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslim infidel, the other major thrust of the Crusades, and the only thing that it was really successful at, was the reconquest of Spain, driving the Muslims out of Spain and making it Christian again. By about 1212, there was a major battle in 1212 in Spain, in which a Christian army inflicted a major defeat on a Muslim army for the first time. And from there on, it was really downhill for the Muslims. By the end of the 13th century, Spain was entirely Christian again, except for Granada. Granada managed to hang on really for another couple of centuries. But for all practical purposes, Muslim Spain was really over. The Christians who were taking it over had really different attitudes. Many of them were deeply anti-Semitic. They were influenced by the attitude of the medieval church toward the Jews. There was one exception, though, in the 12th century, and he was Alfonso X, the King of Castile. In Spanish histories, he's called Alfonso el Sabio, Alfonso the Wise, and he actually welcomed Jews and Christians. He liked what the Muslims had been doing before. He believed that his kingdom would be stronger if it were more diverse, unlike almost any other Christian ruler during the Middle Ages. And he actually welcomed the Jews and the remaining Muslims. One of the things he did was to set up a translation center. At that time, there really was no Spanish language in the sense that we have it today. All of the Visigothic kingdom spoke their own dialect. And Alfonso X has to have all the classics translated by Jewish and Muslim translators into the Castilian dialect of his kingdom. And so there was a large literature written in this Castilian dialect. And this is probably why Castilian became the basis for modern Spanish. Most of the other Spanish dialects died out. Castilian became what evolved into the modern Spanish language. But overall, most of the Christian kings were not like Alfonso X. The Crusades were sparked by religious fanaticism, and it carried over into the way the Christians ruled Spain. There was a declining level of culture. The Crusaders were not nearly as cultured as the Muslims whom they drove out. They brought all the anti-Jewish attitudes of the medieval church into Spain with them. One of the things, oddly enough, that arose during this time when Jews were under a lot of stress was the rise of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. It really had its root, even though the ideas of Kabbalah go all the way back to the 1st century. Modern Kabbalah really had its roots in medieval Spain. The basic text of Kabbalah is the Zohar, which is really a mystical commentary on the Torah and some of the other books of the Bible. And the Zohar was written by a man named Moses ben Shem Tov in Leon in 1250. It's written in an archaic form of Aramaic because he wanted people to believe that it really went all the way back, to the first and second centuries. But scholars are fairly sure it was written during the 13th century. And as time went on, things got worse for the Jews in Spain. In 1391, a series of pogroms began, where many Jews were given the choice of conversion or death. Um, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, which were the most fanatical orders as far as anti-Jewish attitudes, would often send friars into synagogues, and Jews were forced to listen to conversion sermons. Jews were no longer allowed to hold offices in the government in these Christian kingdoms. Um, and things got worse in the 15th century when Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married and united all of Spain under one Christian kingdom. And both of them really were very, very zealous Christians. In fact, they're often referred to in histories of the time as their Catholic majesties. And at a time in the 15th century where every ruler in Europe was a Catholic, you can imagine how zealous you had to be to get a title like that. They're Catholic majesties. And it was Ferdinand and Isabella who brought the Inquisition into Spain in 1480. And Jews were increasingly pressured to either convert or to leave Spain. Many of them left Spain. Many of them converted. There were a number of conversos. And there were two kinds of conversions. Some of them really became sincere Christians. They really felt that, their family had been in Spain for generations. They prospered there. And it was worth converting, to stay in Spain. In fact, some of the most prominent Christian saints actually were converted Jews. Santa Teresa of Avila, who's one of the patron saints of Spain, came from a family of converted Jews. Saint John of the Cross, who was another one of the major Spanish mystics, was also from a family of converted Jews. There were some of them who converted, but secretly continued to practice Judaism. And these were the Marranos, who outwardly converted, but secretly continued to practice Judaism. And these were the ones who were really living dangerous lives. The Inquisition really had their charter was to root out heresy among Christians. They really had no authority over Jews or Christians, or Jews or Muslims rather, as long as they stayed Jews or Muslims. They lobbied to get them expelled from Spain, but they really couldn't charge them as heretics if they weren't Christians in the first place. But any Jew or Muslim who converted to Christianity, then the Inquisition was watching them like a hawk, because any sign of backsliding, any sign that you were still practicing any kind of Jewish customs, and the Inquisition could then take you. So they lived really, really very dangerous lives. For instance, the Inquisition had a number of ways of spying on Jews. One way was actually Jewish cooking. One of the basic cooking oils for Spanish cuisine was lard, which observant Jews obviously couldn't use. Jews cooked with olive oil. And Inquisition spies could actually walk around people's houses during dinner time and literally try to sniff out, who are the Jews and who are the Christians. One of the most popular Jewish prayers, the prayer that opens the Yom Kippur service, Kol Nidre, was written during this time. And people have often raised questions about Kol Nidre, because if you look at the text, what it says is, forgive us for all the vows, all the promises, all the oaths that we're going to make in the coming year. And this has led to a lot of anti-Semitic feeling, the idea the Jews go into their synagogues and they ask God to forgive them for all the promises and oaths they're going to break, during the coming year. It would be one thing if they asked for forgiveness for the promises they couldn't keep in the previous year. But here they're asking to be forgiven, for sins they haven't committed yet, for lies they're going to tell in the year to come. And what was really the likely origin of that is what they were really saying is, I'm going to have to keep my cover, I'm going to have to go to church every Sunday. I'm going to have to repeat prayers I don't believe in. I'm going to have to go to confession and obviously lie to the priest. And I'm asking to be forgiven for that, in advance of this year. So the Ko Nidre was one of the prayers that came out of this period of history. Um, Finally, in 1492, the Inquisition managed to convince Ferdinand and Isabella to finally get rid of all the Jews and Muslims who are still remaining in Spain. Um, the Spanish armies had finally conquered Granada, so the final Muslim stronghold was gone. Spain was now 100% Christians, and so they decided it was time to get rid of all the remaining Jews and Muslims, other than the ones who really sincerely converted to Christianity. And there were a lot of those. It's estimated to be in the tens of thousands, and many prominent Spanish families going forward had Jewish ancestry. You see it in the modern era, during the 1940s, when Francisco Franco had taken over Spain after the Spanish Civil War of the 30s. Even though he was officially a fascist regime, and even though Nazi Germany had actually given him military aid in the Civil War of the 30s, he refused to comply with Hitler's Jewish policies. He refused to deport any Spanish Jews back into Europe to be taken by the Germans. So that any Jew who in Vichy, France, who could get over the Pyrenees into Spain would be safe for the rest of the war. The Spanish would not deport them, back into Europe. Also, Tangier in North Africa, which was a Spanish possession during that time, any North African Jews who could get to Tangier basically were safe for the rest of the war. And everybody always wondered why Franco, would do something like that. But one of the things that many of the Jews did when they converted to Christianity was to take on Spanish names. And the two most popular Spanish names that were taken on by the Jewish conversos were Lopez and Franco. It's very likely Franco also had Jewish ancestors going back to this period. Um, and ironically, the last day the Jews could be in Spain in the summer of 1492 turns out to be the ninth day of Av, Tisha B'Av. It seems it's kind of a coincidence that all these major Jewish disasters, the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, the expulsion from Spain, all seem to be on the ninth day of Av. So Tisha B'Av keeps on getting reinforced as a Jewish day of mourning. In fact, supposedly Jews were leaving harbors for Spain, the same harbor in Spain that Columbus was leaving, on his voyage in 1492 to the New World. And, there are theories that Columbus himself was Jewish. Nobody is really sure. He probably wasn't. But it's a pretty good bet that most of his crew were. It was just a way to get out of town. A lot of Jews actually followed the Spanish conquistadors who followed Columbus. The idea is maybe in a new land, they would be free of the Inquisition, free to practice Judaism openly again. Also, there was one other theory that Columbus believed that he was going to find India. He was sailing to the Indies, and there were many Jews who believed that the 10 lost tribes were out there in the area of India, and so this might be a chance to actually find the 10 lost tribes. So there were really a number of Jewish settlements in the 16th century in Central and in South America where the conquistadors landed. And you can still see the remains of synagogues in places like Barbados, where Columbus first landed. And none of these Jewish communities lasted because the Inquisition followed right behind the conquistadors. And so all of these Jews were again forced to either convert or leave. None of the initial Latin American Jewish communities actually lasted. And so that was the beginning, really, of the Sephardic diaspora. Many of the Sephardic Jews went to Portugal, just because it was right next door. It was the easiest place to get to, immediately but that didn't work out. The King of Portugal was negotiating a marriage between his son and the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Spanish Infanta. And one of the conditions that Ferdinand and Isabella set on the marriage is that he would have to convert. He would have to convert to Portuguese Jews. You know, they would not be. They couldn't stay in Portugal as Jews. But the problem also was the King of Portugal saw what was happening to Spain when the Muslims and Jews left. Spain's economy took a big hit. In fact, one Spanish historian has written that after 1492, when all the Muslims and Jews had left Spain, nobody was left in Spain except priests, lawyers, and soldiers, and that was the beginning of the decline of Spain. And so the king of Portugal didn't want to let the Jews go, but he put heavy pressure on them to convert. And most of the ones who eventually left Portugal literally had to sneak out. They had to escape from Portugal to get to somewhere else. But one of the places that these Portuguese Jews eventually did get to was Amsterdam. For some reason, the Dutch Republic was the only place in Europe during the 16th century that would allow Jews to live there. Jews have been driven out of England, out of France, out of the German states. But for some reason, the Dutch just were very tolerant. They actually allowed refugees from Portugal to settle there. And this was the community that eventually produced the philosopher Spinoza, and also produced the first English Jewish community. You know, the Jews had been driven out of England in 1290 by Edward I. But in the 17th century, when Oliver Cromwell took over England for a while, there was a chance for the Jews to come back. The Puritans of the 17th century really identified with the Jews in a lot of ways. They really, for instance, the Pilgrim Fathers, the people who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were really English Puritans. If you read their writings, they looked at themselves as the new Jews. You know, to them, they were reenacting the Exodus from Egypt. You know, their Pharaoh is the king of Egypt. I mean, rather, the King of England, who was head of the Anglican Church that was persecuting them in England, and they were crossing the sea so they could live by God's law in a new land. And they definitely saw themselves as the new Jews. And so a lot of the Puritans in England thought it might not be a bad idea to have the Jews back. You know, they were kind of interesting Old Testament fossils. And one of the rabbis of the Sephardic congregation in Amsterdam actually went to England and got a meeting with Oliver Cromwell to see if he would allow the Jews to come back to England. And Cromwell actually assembled a commission of bishops and lawyers, and they were to decide two questions. Was Edward I's edict still in force? Was it legal for Jews to come back to England? And secondly, if it was legal, was it a good idea to have Jews back in England? The answer they came back with was that Edward I's edict had never been ratified by his parliament, so that it was only good during his lifetime, so it was no longer in force. As to whether it was a good idea to have the Jews back in England, they couldn't reach a decision on that. But Cromwell decided to take that as a yes, and he invited the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam to come back to London to settle. Probably the other reason that was underlying the whole thing is that Holland and England were in a trade war in the 17th century, and Holland was winning. And Cromwell suspected the Sephardic merchants in Amsterdam had something to do with that, and he wanted some of them in London. So this was the beginning of the Sephardic Jewish community in London. There were a number of other places that the Sephardic diaspora ended up in. Many of them went to Italy. And of course, you may think that was like jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, but actually not. The popes at that time were the Renaissance popes. And most of them were not really religious guys. They were more interested in collecting good art and having a good time than worrying about persecuting Jews. And also, Italy was not really a country at that time. it was a number of different political entities, each one with its own policies. You have the papal states that the popes did run. You have the Kingdom of Naples, the Republic of Florence, the Duchy of Milan, every one of which had its own policies, and many of which welcomed the Jews. And the popes of that era actually were not interested in persecuting Jews. In a sense, the Spaniards were really more Catholic than the Italians were during this period. You can see that kind of attitude if you look at what happened to Galileo. He ran afoul of the church by some of his writings, but all he really got as a punishment was house arrest, and he agreed not to publish anything else, which is really, as the Inquisition was a slap on the wrist. In Spain, he would have been burned at the stake. And so many of the Jews found a home in Italy. Um, and many others actually went back to the Ottoman Empire. Most of the empire that the Arabs had conquered, they had lost, and most of the Middle East, Southern Europe, and North Africa were now part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire at this point in the 16th century was on the way up as far as power and influence were concerned. And there were a number of sultans who welcomed the Jews. And so the Jews set up settlements all through the Ottoman Empire. One of the largest Sephardic communities in the world was in Thessalonica in Greece, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, which eventually was destroyed during the Holocaust. But they set up communities in Turkey itself, in Istanbul, in Izmir, and a number of other Turkish cities. Some of them went back to Palestine. This was not modern Zionism, but they were living as Ottoman subjects in Palestine, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. A number of the Spanish refugees, some of the Spanish mystics, set up a community in the north of Israel in the town of Safat. And Safat really is where modern Kabbalah was born. There were a community of mystics there. They were eventually led by an immigrant from Egypt named the Ari, Isaac Luria. And Isaac Luria really is the founder of Kabbalah, as is practiced today by Jewish mystics. And if you've ever visited Safat, if you visited Israel, it's really worth seeing. It's a beautiful little town. It's very high up in the mountains near a Lebanese border, overlooking the Hula Valley. And one thing, they say the synagogue that the Spanish refugees built, it's still there. And mostly now it's an artist colony. They make candles, they make all sorts of decorative things, they make mezuzahs, that sort of thing. And of course, one of the things that you're struck by is the pervasive odor of marijuana smoke, as you walk through Safat. And it said that, between the actual physical altitude, the Kabbalah that's studied there, and the pot smoking is literally the highest place in Israel in every possible sense of the word. But they did make a contribution, though, to Jewish practice today. For instance, the Kabbalah Shabbat service that we read on Friday nights was developed in Safat. Basically before that, there was no special Sabbath service on Friday nights. You just did the regular weekday Ma'ariv service on Friday nights. The real Sabbath service was on Saturday morning. The Kabbalists at Safat believed that there should be a special service to welcome the Sabbath on Friday evenings. And so they really originated the Kabbalah Shabbat service. The Lachot Odig, which we sing as part of that service, was written at Safat by a man named Shlomo Alkabetz, one of the mystics who was there. And actually, the next time you go to a Friday night service, if you look at the Lachot Odig, he actually worked his name into it. Every verse of Lachot Odig starts with a letter of his name. For instance, the first verse, Shamor V'Zachor, Shin. The second verse, Likrat Shabbat, Lamed. And if you look at the first word of each of the verses of Lachot Odig, it spells Shlomo Alkabetz. He sort of stamped his own name on it. So they did make a contribution even into modern Jewish practice. Many of them settled in Egypt because this is where Maimonides set up shop. There was a very affluent Jewish community in Cairo, which Maimonides was part. And there was really no Sephardic migration to the Americas, though, till about the 18th century. Some of them came over from England. There, if you go to Charleston, there's some very old Sephardic Jewish families there. Also in Savannah, some of them came over from the English Sephardic community. In the Latin America, there really were no Jewish immigrants till the 19th century from Europe. And again, there are a number of Sephardic communities here in America. They obviously are the minority. America, as far as the Jewish community is concerned, is obviously an Ashkenazic country. But there still are large Sephardic congregations in places like New York, Boston, Chicago. The Spanish Republic never really recognized the Jews until 1869. It remained a monarchy actually till 1869. Spain was really the last country that the 18th century European Enlightenment reached. It was really kind of behind the curve. But it was not till 1869 that Spain became a secular republic and other religions were tolerated. It wasn't really till 1968 that the Edict of Expulsion of Ferdinand and Isabella was formally rescinded by the Spanish Parliament. Better late than never. And Spain has always been very ambivalent, though, about its Jews. Spain really didn't recognize the state of Israel until 1986, one of the very last nations or European nations to recognize Israel. So it's interesting, in the last 10 years, probably because Spain has been in a lot of economic trouble, there now is a new campaign where Spain is advertising, and Israel and a lot of other places, for Sephardic Jews to reclaim their heritage. They're being welcomed back to Spain, Jews and Muslims. I think probably because of the economic problems that Spain is having. They're hoping maybe having the Jews back, might help things there. But the Sephardic Jews really, for a long time, considered themselves the aristocrats of the Jewish world. They looked down on the German, French Jews. They looked down on the Middle Eastern Jews who had never left the Middle East, and many of them still really do consider themselves as the most aristocratic Jews of the entire Jewish world. And at one time they really were. Anyone have any questions or comments?
I do, Fred. I actually have two questions. You knew I would. What was in the Western Europe, England, you weren't allowed to touch people's bodies, or autopsies weren't, but the Islam says you could, but that was more in Iran, etc. How was that in Spain? Because Jewish people would come from England to the Middle East, essentially to learn how to be a doctor.
Yeah. Well, actually, Jewish law on autopsy, an autopsy can't be done just as a routine if there's no strong reason for it. That would be considered a needless mutilation of the body. But if there's a medical reason for it, if let's say if there may be contagious disease as a cause of death, that's a threat to the rest of the community, you need to know that. Let's say there's a genetic disease, which the rest of the family needs to know about. Autopsy would be permitted under those circumstances.
But I mean more in the Middle Ages, the Christians wouldn't let
No.
you touch or research or do anything.
Oh, no,
to a
no, the
body.
Christians wouldn't, no.
So how did that
No.
work in Spain, or did you have to go further east to have that ability to learn that? Because they did it a ton in Persia in the 12th century.
Yeah. No, the Muslims were very advanced in that way. In Muslim countries, you could. The Muslims had set up schools of medicine. They dissected bodies. They were way ahead of the Christian Europeans as far as medicine was concerned. But you're right, in Christian Spain, you certainly couldn't do it.
Okay. Second question, could you discuss, we were talking about proselytizing. I brought it up briefly on Sunday as a random question, that it was done in the 8th century, the Visigoths?
It was. Well, a lot of it was done actually earlier on, during the Greco-Roman period. there's a line in the Mishnah which is actually quoted from Hillel, where he says, "Love all men and draw them closer to Torah." And that's usually interpreted as all men, not Jews. Draw everybody you can to Torah. There's a famous story, I think you probably all heard it, of the pagan who comes to see Shammai and says, "I want you to teach me. I'm a busy man, but I'd like to know about Judaism. So can you teach me the Torah while I stand on one foot?" And Shammai thought, he's mocking me, drove him out. And Hillel, when he does the same thing, Hillel says, "Sure, I can. Don't do to anyone else what you would not want done to yourself. The rest is all commentary. Go study." And the tradition is the guy eventually did go study and eventually became a rabbi, in his own right. But both actually in the first couple of centuries, first really 3 centuries of this era, both Jews and Christians were actively proselytizing. If you were an educated, sophisticated Roman, it had to be a little bit embarrassing to be worshiping a pantheon of gods that were really just humans on steroids. And then you had all the brutal aspects of Roman life, crucifixion, watching gladiators fight to the death for entertainment, throwing prisoners to wild animals, literally throwing away unwanted babies, and which embarrassed some of the more sensitive Romans. And so a lot of them did convert to Christianity and Judaism, but in the race between Christianity and Judaism, the Christians won, mainly because the two things that are really most attractive to the pagans about Judaism, number one was monotheism, the one invisible, transcendent God, and Jewish morality. If you converted to Christianity, you could have that. You could have Jewish morality, you could have monotheism, but you could still have bacon for breakfast. You didn't have to get circumcised. You didn't have to be too picky about the Sabbath. And so basically, Christianity was winning the fight. And then once Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, then any other proselytizing was forbidden. So from the 4th century on, proselytizing pretty much stopped. And,
So Fred, just as a point to confirm what you were just saying, Mindy and I went to Southeast Spain a few years ago. We went to Cordoba, Toledo, Seville, and noticed as we were walking around, we had a tour guide, of course, with like 14 people, but it was so obvious the Jewish presence there with the highs in the walkways, and there was mezuzahs there, and the tour guide was just going on and on about the Jewish presence. And it was just amazing. And then when I asked a question, how many Jews are actually in this city? I mean, you could count them on maybe one hand.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, unfortunately, to your point, there was a huge presence, and their legacy is just amazing, but the presence now is almost non-existent.
Yeah. No, as I said, they're trying to bring some Jews back. It hasn't
Yeah.
been too successful so far. No. The other thing which is really significant about that period that led up to 1492, it's really the beginning of what we would call modern anti-Semitism. Most anti-Semitism in the early Middle Ages in Europe was really religious. Jews had killed Christ. Jews refused to accept Jesus as the Messiah because they were either too blind or else they realized he was Messiah, but they were too stubborn or malicious, to admit it. And a Jew who converted was welcomed. It was really a religious anti-Semitism. But that changed in Spain. A lot of the Spaniards didn't really want to accept the converted Jew. They really believed there was something about Judaism beyond the religion, that even if a Jew converted, he was still really a Jew, which actually is what Jews believe. So you can't really blame them. But their anti-Semitism really was racial anti-Semitism, the kind that persisted into the modern world. It didn't matter whether Jews converted or not, they were always still Jews. And there's a very famous story that comes out of the Spanish Inquisition period. A Jew who was living in a village in Spain, and he was given the choice of either leaving or converting. And he thought about it. He decided his family had been there for generations. He was going to convert. So he went to the village priest and told him he was ready to convert. And over the next few months, he takes instruction from the priest. And finally, the time comes for his official conversion. He's baptized and he takes communion. And at the climax of the ceremony, he kneels in front of the altar, and the priest puts his hands on his head and says 3 times, You were a Jew, now you're a Christian. You were a Jew, now you're a Christian. You were a Jew, now you're a Christian. Well, a few weeks after this, the priest decides to go visit him. You'll see how the newest member of his flock is coming along. And it's a Friday, about the middle of the day. And as he walks into the man's house, they're eating lunch. And the priest is horrified to see the man digging into a big steak. He says, I can't believe you're doing this. You know it's a sin to eat meat on Friday. We talked about this, during your instruction. You've only been a Christian barely a month and you're already backsliding. And the man starts laughing and says, no, please, Father, don't be upset. This is not what it looks like. You see, before we slaughtered the cow to make lunch today, I put my hands on its head and I said 3 times, you were a cow, now you're a fish. You were a cow, now you're a fish. Which is pretty much the attitude of Christians and Jews to the Jews who were converting them. Anybody have any other questions or any other comments? Okay. Well, next week we'll talk about the Ashkenazic Jews, the Jews of Europe outside of Spain.
Fred,
See you guys next week.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you,
Okay.
Fred.
Fred.
See you guys.
Thank you for